Well, hello again, and welcome to another edition of Off to Tube and AP European History Distance Learning. It is absolutely fantastic to be broadcasting to each and every one of you today. And this week really marks yet again another week of revolution in European history, which really from the 18th through the 19th century, revolutions are kind of a dime a dozen. This is a major upturning of European society, and when you studied this in AP World History, you studied the Atlantic revolutions, the French Revolution, you studied the Industrial Revolution, and we talked about all the changes that happened to European society, but we didn't realize and really look into the incredible pain and angst and anxiety that it really caused for Europeans and for European society. It was not like these changes just happened gently. They happened rather suddenly. They happened with a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of confusion, and that's why you see throughout the 19th century a variety of and a repeat of revolution and changes until eventually you get to the end of the 19th century, where Europe is, as we'll study next week or in a couple weeks, enters into what's known as the Age of Anxiety, which of course all of you can relate to, especially since you're teenagers, and that's basically the age of anxiety. As you started looking at last week, the beginning of our time period from 1814 to about, or 1815, excuse me, to about 1850, 1848. This is going to be the first half of the 19th century, and there's two contradictory trends that are happening during that time. On the one hand, after the chaos of the French Revolution and Napoleon, you have monarchies applying conservative order all across Europe, trying to bring Europe back to the way it was. Those good old glory days of feudalism and the ancient regime, where the monarchy and the aristocracy worked together with the church to provide morality and social stability. But the problem is that you also studied another major event that was happening in Europe, and that was industrialization. And industrialization, particularly in England, is going to be a grassroots movement that is going to dramatically shift the way that Europeans live their lives. I mean, there was obviously economic changes, as now agriculture still important, but less important to the European economy with the rise of industry and the mass production of goods using factories. You see a change in the way that people work. Instead of workers owning the means of production, they are now reliant upon going to a business owner's place of business and working for them. Their only commodity is their labor, not necessarily their tools or their know-how, but just simply their time and their effort. And then, of course, as you read last week, that creates all sorts of changes. I mean, when do you go to the bathroom at work? I mean, when you're working in the fields, you just kind of step off and go, which is why bathroom breaks had to become a thing in businesses and why people had to stop, I don't know, peeing on the machines. Again, dramatic shifts. This is going to upset the social hierarchy of Europe as you begin to see the aristocracy still playing a role and trying to maintain authority, but you have this rising, growing bourgeois, bougie middle class that is becoming more and more important with industrialization. You have a new class of workers known as the working class who are laboring and working and struggling in the factories and in the slums and the tenements of the cities. I mean, this is dramatically shifting and changing European society. So on the one hand, you have the people in power trying to bring it back to the way it was. But on the other hand, you have this massive movement that is dramatically changing and undermining all of those very things that the conservative order was fighting. And so, what you read about last week was largely about the changes that occurred. And like I said, part of that changing was the way that people worked. And so, especially when you look at the working class and the plight of the working class, by the time you get to 1830 ish, you start to see more of a focus on, oh my goodness, what's happening to these people? You start to see even bourgeois middle class and even some upper class nobility and government officials saying, man, maybe there needs to be some sort of shifts because there's some major issues going on with the way that the working class is being treated. And so that's really what we're going to look at today. Is as industrialization is taking root, especially in England, but then of course anywhere across the continent. You see conservatism obviously is going to be very anti-industrialization because, well, the conservative order is trying to go back to the agrarian roots. But there's going to be these ideologies of revolution that Spielvogel talks about that are going to develop largely as a response to all the things that are happening with industrialization. So I just wanted to look at the responses to what liberalism, and we're going to define what liberalism is, and we're going to talk about the rise of socialism today. Communism we'll talk about as we get further into our content. That's going to be a whole different discussion. But we're going to look at some of the responses to the changes that are happening in industrialization. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is just the fact that the working class is going to have a response to this. The working class is going to start to develop this idea of what's called class consciousness. Now, this is going to make a lot of sense when we start talking about Karl Marx, but what I mean by class consciousness is the working class is realizing kind of who they are and what role they're playing in society. Particularly, this is the role that they are playing in producing goods. Now, this whole idea of class consciousness really actually starts with artisans and craftsmen, people who have traditionally had a sense of identity in the work that they do. And this is largely because of the guild system that was in Europe before industrialization. In towns and cities, you had individual crafts and individual industries that are going to have their own guild or kind of quasi-trade union. And that industry is going to be regulated by these guilds. And so you were defined by what role you had within the guild. Are you an apprentice? Are you a journeyman? Are you a master craftsman? I mean, where are you? And that all depends on your definition of who you are is going to depend on what stage you are in that guild. And so when we start to see this kind of class consciousness, and especially as we start to see the shift away from artisans and more into the production of goods using machines, you see pushback from these artisans. These are the kind of lower middle class-ish bourgeois that are really going to be heavily impacted by the rise of and the use of machines to produce goods. Right? And they believe that their dignity, their self-worth comes in their ability to produce something using their hands, using their tools, using their labor. But as you see more things being produced by machines, you have the de-skilling of labor. Like I said before, labor is now more just, hey, can you watch this machine? Hey, can you make sure this machine is working? Hey, can you help this machine do it? It's not something that causes skilled labor to be used. And so therefore, the first people who are really going to have a huge issue with industrialization are going to be these artisans. And you see that in a couple of movements. The first is the Luddites and of Captain Swing. The Luddites, both are actually going to be very similar. They're just going to be two kind of separate movements. Both the Luddites and the Captain Swing movement are going to be these artisans who are going to go into factories and actively destroy machines. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to make a statement to say, hey, you need us. Stop taking away our modality of living. Stop trying to take away our ability to feed our families and to work and taking away our dignity. Which is why if you talk to anybody who is anti-technology, who doesn't want to work Zoom or doesn't want to work Skype or FaceTime or tick-tockety, tickety-clickety-clackety, you can call them a Luddite. That is a term for somebody who is anti machines, because the Luddites would literally go in and break those machines. Now the Captain Swing movement is a really interesting one because, again, it's one of these movements where you see machines being broken up in the countryside, particularly in kind of the outskirts of cities. And they would literally sign it with signed. They would put a little nail, like a little sign thing that says, thanks to Captain Swing, we're doing that. We don't really know who Captain Swing is, if it was even a person or what it was, but these are just two movements. Again, part of the working class that's going to help develop this idea of who are we? We are something that is different. Now again, as we get into the industrialization even more and more people are working in factories, we also see the development of trade unions. Now this is largely going to grow in the beginning half of the 19th century after those combination acts are repealed in England, after trade unions are actually legalized and the ability to strike is actually granted. Now this was seen as the reason why there were so many strikes is actually because the laws were too harsh, and if you give the unions the right to organize, maybe they'll calm down a little bit. But you see trade unions arguing for things like you can see there, 8-hour work days, 8 hours of recreation, 8 hours of rest, fair pay, fair wages, hopefully better living conditions as well. So again, you see that the working class beginning to themselves actually fight back against the ill treatment that they were getting because of the changing nature of work. But the working class wasn't the only ones to respond. And the bourgeoisie or the middle class are also going to be, you're also going to have these responses by the middle class to these complaints of workers, to the plight of the working class. And of course, one of those ideologies that's going to be pretty much the bourgeois ideology is liberalism. Now, liberalism has its roots in the Enlightenment. In fact, it traces its ideology back to the ideas of Adam Smith and his development of capitalism. Now, Adam Smith's idea of capitalism is really just taking the scientific principles of observation and evidence and using mathematical reasoning and applying it to the economy, and realizing that the economy can be understood in mathematical terms. And of course, for those of you that are seniors, you are studying this under Ms. Verhoeven or under Mr. De Vries, and you're realizing that the economy is a market, and it's a relationship between demand, the people wanting something, and supply, a business owner then supplying that demand. Where supply and demand meet, well, that's going to be your price. So if the demand goes up and the supply stays down, well, that price is going to go up. If demand starts to go down and supply goes up, well, the price is going to go down. But what Adam Smith argued is that a market will regulate itself. A market will be guided by what is known as an invisible hand. These market forces of supply and demand will work out themselves. Nobody has to interfere in the economy in order for it to work efficiently. And in fact, any sort of government intervention is going to ruin a market and to harm a market and won't act true to what a market needs. And that's where you get this idea of laissez-faire. Now, laissez-faire economics is, of course, made popular by one of the more famous songs, a song that goes, laissez-faire, 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 whispered Uncle Adam, laissez-faire. Because of course that song popularized by the Beatles. Now they translated it into English because those little British bowl cuts. And that they translated it to "Let It Be," and that's what laissez-faire economics is. It's when a government should let the economy be. There should be no intervention. Now again, this goes directly against the ideology of mercantilism and government intervention in the economy through tariffs, through monopolies, through charters. A government should just let a market be. These ideas are added on by a couple of influential thinkers as well, one of them being Thomas Malthus. Now, Thomas Malthus is a fascinating figure, and when you talk about the ideas of Thomas Malthus, oftentimes what you'll hear is, yes, this was a Malthusian event. And in fact, this is god-awful, but Malthus would actually probably argue that COVID-19 was a Malthusian event. And what he means by that is that periodically there's going to be population booms due to whatever, new technology, new foodstuffs, and everything. But if there's too many people, well, then you're going to see that the resources are going to get more scarce, things are going to be an issue, so nature is going to fight back. So there's either going to be a disease, there's going to be a flood, there's going to be some natural disaster, but also the plight of the working class, those terrible working conditions, those diseases that are rampant within the cities, those are also nature providing a check on population. And so he argued that a government should not try to regulate working conditions or living conditions because nature needs to take its course. If you don't, then you're going to have way too many people. And as Mr. Gettler will tell you, humans are using way too many Earths as it is. And so therefore the Earth will be destroyed by the time 2040 comes around. That's terrifying. Another individual who was influential in liberal ideology, who also was an extension of Adam Smith's capitalism, was David Ricardo, who popularized this idea of the iron law of wages, who said this idea of a minimum wage is, again, it's a government intervention that's going to harm a market. It's not going to be efficient. And Ricardo would say that over the long haul, workers and wages are going to reflect the need for a standard of living, right? So whatever people need to make in order to survive, well, wages will eventually get there, because again, if a worker isn't making enough money, well, they should just go find another job that hires that. Jobs should be competing for workers as well, just like they're competing for other people's money and trying to produce the best product for the lowest price. So Ricardo and other liberals would believe any sort of government intervention is actually going to harm. It's not scientific. It is going to cause more issues than it will help. Now, that's economic liberalism. Liberalism was also going to be an ideology that promoted those Enlightenment ideals of individual liberty, right? The liberals are going to be promoting this idea of the freedom of speech, the press, the assembly. They believe they should be able to criticize the government and speak out for what it is that they believe in. And especially they believed that it was important for governments to get input from the common people through these legislative bodies. Now, when I say people, it's in quotations on purpose here, because liberals are definitely not arguing for universal male suffrage. They do not want the working class voting. They just want the extension for the right to vote and the extension for the right to be elected to public office for the bourgeois elite, for those middle class business owners that were having a bigger influence in European society. So they believe in these legislative bodies, but they also believe that the people who are voting and can be elected, there still should be some sort of property qualifications. In Spielvogel's book, it says they were certainly not Democrats, they were liberals. And again, liberalism is going to be the dominant ideology of the bourgeoisie. And you can see here why the bourgeoisie would have this liberal ideology, because it's through business that they are able to gain all of the wealth and status that they had. This is their ability to join in with the ranks of the landed aristocracy, their ability to become the more influential of European society. And so you can see here also bourgeois parlors, yes, wearing their suits and discussing the business and enjoying the finer things in life that the Industrial Revolution had to offer, and of course the wonderful paintings. And yes, so the bourgeois society again is trying to prove that it is also just as, if not more important than the landed aristocracy. They want their day in politics and in society, which is why they're arguing for liberalism. So as we talk about liberalism, I do just want to make sure you understand. Liberalism as understood in the 19th century means something very different from liberalism in the United States today. Right? Liberalism in the United States today is closer to what its title is, being a Democrat. However, there are some similarities there, especially this focus on individual liberties. It's the individual that's important, not necessarily the collective. But liberalism today isn't necessarily only a bourgeois ideology, it's also an ideology of many classes. So there are some of those differences there. Now, liberalism is not the only response to these working classmen, and a liberal would look at the plight of the working class and say, well, that's just part of the market. Don't intervene now, it will get better over time. And so they would be arguing against things like allowing unions, against a minimum wage, against minimum working hours, certainly against the abolition of child labor and things. So this union movement, that's going to be a liberal nightmare. However, the liberals are going to be the ones pushing for some change politically, particularly in what's known as the Chartist movement in England. The Chartists are going to begin to espouse Enlightenment ideas and push for that in British Parliament. And so eventually, by the end of the 19th century, as you see more and more bourgeois participation in politics, that's largely because of the Chartist movement and the push of prominent liberals for more representation in British government. Now, the middle class was not all liberal, and in fact, there were some bourgeois elite who were rejecting some of that individualism and that faith in technology and science to improve the human condition. Some who looked at the way that liberalism was being promoted, this idea of rationality and reason, and saw, man, this is actually causing more harm than good. They looked at the working class and said, holy cow, look at their health, look at their well-being, look at their lives that they're living, look at the conditions in which they're laboring, and they said, this is not rational. This doesn't make sense. And so socialists are going to also apply Enlightenment ideas and imply Enlightenment thinking using reason and rationality, and especially this belief in progress, to reject what liberals were saying and to say there needs to be a shift in the way that we are organizing society. And one of the first individuals to begin to talk about this is Saint-Simon, or Saint Simon, who's going to be arguing that if there isn't a focus on improving the lives of workers in France, right, especially with this new working class, you're going to have a class of people who are just going to die out. And if any of these classes die out, it is going to harm all. So he's one of the first to argue that, hey, we should actually be paying attention to what's going on with the working class and perhaps try to improve their condition. Now then you have Charles Fourier, another Frenchman who is going to be kind of the father of socialism, and he's going to be one of those individuals who really is going to be known as this utopian socialist. The early socialists are certainly not what your Bernie Sanders are doing, right? They're not going to be the same thing that you see as socialism today. These utopian socialists are doing just that. They are trying to figure out how to create a perfect world. They are envisioning what a perfect society would be. And Charles Fourier does just that with his idea of the phalanx communities. He takes this scientific idea and said, okay, he says, okay, well, if there are 4 major personality types, then we need to figure out, and each of these 4 personality types has certain qualities that makes them be able to do certain jobs really well. If you're a type A personality, then well, you'd probably be good in organizing things for a society, being an accountant, being a government official, somebody who's gonna make sure all the details are covered. If you're more of a Mr. Oftedal dreamer, like to work with your back and your labor and work hard and sweat and put a shovel in the dirt, well, then you should be a builder. You should be somebody who is out in the fields plowing. He broke up humans into different societies and figured if there's 4 different personality types, and you just need to figure out how many people does it take to have a self-sufficient community. So he believed that there should be, instead of huge cities or huge towns or huge villages, there should just be these small little communities of about 810 people. That was the number he came up with, 810 people, and they would be called phalanxes. And each group is going to have a certain number of each of the 4 different personality types. And the entire group is going to work together in order to produce everything that the group needs. And he had it thought out. I mean, if you are an angry kind of murderous type, perfect. You're going to be a butcher. Even children had their own station in Fourier's society, because children, what do they love to do? Well, they love to get dirty. They love to roll in the mud. We'll let them take care of the garbage. So they'll be the ones cleaning up, taking out the garbage. They get to roll around, get dirty, get disgusting, and they get to help society. Again, it sounds absolutely crazy to us because he's envisioning what he thinks a perfect utopian society would be. And it's really a sad thing, because poor Charles Fourier, he puts out an advertisement in a French newspaper and says, please meet me at this cafe to discuss my ideas, and we will change the world and we'll bring about some major great things. And then nobody meets him. So the poor guy just sat there all day, probably sipping his coffee, looking down, maybe stirring in some milk, just all alone. But again, I want to highlight with Charles Fourier in his phalanx communities, he's the father of socialism. He's this utopian socialist, somebody who envisioned a perfect society. Not necessarily a practical society, but a perfect society. Another more actually pointed and interesting, I think, individual who was one of the early socialists, it comes from a pretty unlikely source, and that's Robert Owen. And Robert Owen had become incredibly wealthy off of his textile manufacturing in Manchester, England. He became incredibly wealthy through the plight of the working class. His laborers are what brought him wealth. And what Robert Owen winds up doing, though, is realizing, hey, man, my workers are working real hard, and boy, their living conditions are pretty terrible. I wonder if I could increase output if I began to take better care of them. And so Robert Owen does just that in his in one of his factory areas, and he begins to build them not build them tenements. That's funny. He begins to build them housing. He begins to provide schooling. He begins to provide some of these social necessities for his workers that society was not giving them. And what he found is that it did increase output. Workers were working way harder for him because of all the benefits that he was giving them. And he took this idea and began to argue that in Parliament, Parliament called him in thinking he would be this liberal, bourgeois, anti-socialist voice to try to quell these revolutionary ideas. And he sits there and goes, no, I think this is what we should do. And absolutely shocked them. And Robert Owen made it kind of his life's mission to then try and recreate that perfect little utopian socialist working society that he had done in his mills. And when he goes to try and do that in the United States, it winds up being a complete flop. And it doesn't increase output. It causes him to lose money and becomes just one of those sad cases of something that worked in one place but didn't work in another. But it's really interesting, and especially really interesting to look at what Robert Owen did and compare it to what tech companies in Palo Alto and Silicon Valley are doing today. Right, Google having nap pods and flexible work schedules and free food and games and bikes and transportation, all these things. And Google is claiming, and these companies are claiming, that they're getting way better output from their workers because of all the social benefits that they're getting. I remember one of my favorite things in the company I worked for a year was they built a yoga studio, and they allowed a yoga teacher to come in each week, and I had to pay for it, but it was still pretty cool to, on my lunch break, go and do some yoga, and go and shower, and then go back to work. So interesting to see how that developed. Now, there were also kind of what I call practical socialists, and this is really going to start to develop as socialism spreads out. And this is more later in the time period, so I'm not going to focus too much on them right now, because especially when you're looking at socialism for this week, it's really those utopian socialists. But you do see Flora Tristan, who's going to be a very famous French socialist, who's going to link feminism to socialism. She's going to start saying that it's not just the working class, but it's also women who should also be included in that. But again, it should also be that we are trying to fix the ails of those who are marginalized. As we get to further on, we're going to see thinkers like Louis Blanc are going to say, okay, well, socialism isn't going to just arise out of itself. We should actually start working with the government and start forming official parties like the Labor Party and starting to work through government in order to bring these things out. And boy, oh boy, can I not wait to get to the more radical socialists as we get to Proudhon, our radical hipster individual here, who is going to become an anarchist socialist thinker. And then, of course, we'll also get to Karl Marx as well. But you know, at first, I just wanted you to see how really the ideologies of liberalism and socialism are going to be the ideologies that are going to be looking at the plight of the working class and disagreeing with each other. But at the same time, both liberals and socialists are fighting each other, but they're also fighting conservatives. And this is really where the rubber meets the road in European societies during the first half of the 19th century. Because like I said, conservatives are trying to restore that old world order to Europe, to try to put away all those revolutionary sentiments and rebuild Europe to the way it was. Well, the Industrial Revolution is making that impossible. And with the rise of the bourgeoisie, you also see the rise in the spread of these bourgeois ideologies of revolution, namely liberalism and socialism. Liberalism trying to get more rights for the bourgeois elites, and socialism trying to get more rights for the working class and the bourgeois elites. So I just wanted you to understand that these are definitely, while they are competing ideologies, they're also working together to tear down conservative Europe. So this then leads to what your first supplemental assignment is going to be. And that first supplemental assignment is going to be a DBQ, which is essentially arguments for workers. You're going to be looking at the different responses to the plight of the working class. So this is where I would really like you to go through steps 1 through 4 on your own. Step 1 being reading the directions, making sure you understand what is expected of you in a DBQ. Step 2, breaking down the prompt. You can see I haven't done either of these for you, so I'd like you guys to do this by highlighting the important things here, highlighting the question in various colors for the action word that it's saying, the topic, the time period, the place. I'd like you to then also, as you're breaking down the prompt, rewrite the prompt in your own words, just so that you understand what it is that you're looking for. Then I'd like you to do step 3, and I'd like you to write down here, brainstorm possible answers. Now, I kind of just spent the first part of this video giving you those possible answers to what this is. So that's why I want to do that lecture, to kind of give you the context and get your brain working. But you want to think, what are some various responses about the working class's conditions during the 19th century? Just know I edited this DBQ a little bit so that it's really only the ideologies from the first part of the 19th century. Then I'd like you to go through step 4. I'd like you to go around the horn for all of the documents. There are 7 of them, so make sure you tell me what the argument is, tell me what the HIP is, tell me what any outside information. Please do at least 2 of those, 2 pieces of outside information through the whole thing. So throughout the 7 documents, choose 2 that'll give you an outside piece of information. And then tell me how the documents corroborate or modify or qualify each other on the right-hand side here. Once you're done going through step 4, then I'd like you to go down here and fill out step 5. I'd like you to give me some groupings. So I'd like you to find at least 3 ways the documents corroborate to answer the question. So identify the grouping and then write the numbers of the documents that prove the argument. So for example, there might be some liberal, laissez-faire responses to the plight of the working class. And those are arbitrary numbers. Those do not actually work. But if that was the case, then you say 2, 5, 6, and 7. So just give me your groupings here. What are 3 different reactions that you see happening to the plight of the working class? Then what I call step 5.5. This is what you would do to kind of begin to prepare for organizing and writing your essay. So these are kind of the major essay skills that you need to do throughout your essay at some point. So from your reactions that you found, I want you to choose at least 2 of those and give me a thesis statement. Just write me a thesis statement that responds to the prompt here. Make sure that you respond to all parts of the prompt, and make sure you give me John Mayer explanations in there as well. Then I'd like you to choose 2 documents. I want you to use it to prove your thesis, and I want you to give me a HIP check for each of them. Explain how the historical context, intended audience, point of view, and purpose is relevant to your specific argument. Now again, I'm removing some of the aids and examples for you because I want you to start being able to do this on your own. This is your practice for the AP exam. This is your practice for being able to complete a DBQ on your own. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. But until then, opt it all out.